Good morning, everyone. My name is Garima. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm calling you today from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations in West Coast of Canada. The topic of my talk today is developing trauma-informed practices in, with, for design. I will start this conversation by telling you that I have been conducting so many design research workshops in the last couple of years, facilitating workshops and practicing in different conversations about researching in health and service design. The notion of trauma-informed care practices have started to show up pretty consistently. In my second life, I also work as an outreach worker. I've been doing that for many years, very part-time now, but we support homeless clients living with multiple barriers and health challenges in Vancouver. I've started to think about how carefully and considered at first, but now quite second nature, my interactions with my clients are in non-research settings. I've noticed how these subtle methods of interaction and interpersonal dynamics show up so frequently in the way that I conduct research in design spaces as well. I remember watching a video of myself facilitating a research workshop with a group of people living with dementia in a care home. I saw that my voice had changed. I spoke slower, softer, slightly more melodic. My body language was different, attentive, responsive. And that's not just me. I've witnessed my design research colleagues do the same in other workshop settings. How we embody the power dynamics occurring in design research situations and unconsciously and consciously take up or renounce space is quite fascinating. So this is where I begin my talk today. I will tell you a story of one workshop, which is a part of a larger project. I see this as a story because the ideas that I present today are not formalized. They're just explorations and a recounting of a set of experiences. In the story, I touch upon experiences of trauma and consider how re-traumatization in design research process can be proactively mitigated, paying close attention to how we set the scene for research and ask certain questions that might otherwise be triggering, trigger traumatic memories or traumatic responses. I've been looking at workshops and works of various different designers from all over, including Rachel Diepkes, Sada Fatahala, and Jack Speschler, who are looking to incorporate trauma-informed practices in design research. I've also been exploring authors that are developing strategies of emergence, relationality, and joy as a way to build resilience and a way to push through trauma. The workshop that I talk about today is a part of a larger master's thesis that explores resilient and relational services. As mentioned before, I worked as an outreach worker for a small organization that is a branch of the City of Vancouver's homelessness services. I chose to begin my master's exploration by researching with my colleagues at this very unique organization. This organization has radical roots in its origin story, but it is slowly shifting due to changing scope of the program and burgeoning systemic challenges, especially relating to the housing and opioid crisis as experienced in Vancouver. As I embarked on this research, I explored the question, how do staff in this particular organization relate to the systems within which they work? And how do relational connections come into play in how they navigate systemic hurdles and challenges? As a design researcher, I was to use design research methods to learn from my colleagues in hopes to incorporate their experiences to a larger relational service design framework. I started my exploration in a very informal way. This is workshop one, or even maybe before workshop one. I invited some of my colleagues to a facilitated workshop over beers. In the workshop, I asked them to understand systems that they are a part of from a permaculture lens. I asked them to describe relationships they most rely on, considering these interactions as interconnected and relational nodes, rather than viewing them in isolation. We were expressing some heavy experiences through natural metaphors, and the whole experience felt very cathartic. As such, I decided to take a version of this very workshop to my entire office, to involve all of my colleagues in the office to participate in this type of conversation. Through this workshop, I was not only hoping to highlight relational resilience practiced by frontline workers in complex systemic challenges and how this can be modeled in other service settings, I was also hoping in some way to impart some shift in organizational practices in this workplace towards non-hierarchical participation in order to make people feel like they're being heard and their voices and experiences matter. This is sort of a dual agenda, and it stemmed from a basic assumption that design research that on the one hand is meant to generate knowledge most likely to develop interventions or outcomes. This process of knowledge making also has an ontological impact. The methods that we introduce changes the setting, infuses new values and ways of being. Even if the impact, the effect, the taste of being in conversation with each other through sharing embodied knowledge maybe might only last a short while. I got 2 of my managers on board to conduct these workshops as a way to do my research and to introduce new and cathartic set of activities to the group, my colleagues, that gave them a space to share and be heard. So these would be 3 to 4 workshops that would take place at the office right after work. To give you context about this workplace, this office services an average of 110 people every day who come in with all sorts of very complex problems and are served by about 8 to 9 people in a 7-hour workday. This is high stress and a very fast-paced work environment. Change, intentional or unintentional, is a feat to contend with when working and exploring with groups of people or communities that have or continue to live with traumatic experiences. Here, I was about to talk about systems change with a group of people that are having to mitigate trauma of all of their clients that walk into their office every day while managing their own experiences with firsthand or secondhand trauma inside and outside of the workplace while navigating many systemic constraints day in and day out. I won't talk too much about the proceedings of the actual research work, but instead focus on everything that led up to the workshops themselves from a trauma-informed lens to illustrate some successes and, let's say, things that could have been done better. So the first workshop took place on a summer Wednesday. I was walking towards the office with my roll of paper and my craft supplies for the workshop when I noticed a group of people were huddled outside of the front door, resuscitating an overdose victim. 2 of my colleagues were the first responders. It was a pretty intense situation to walk into. Ambulance soon showed up and the victim awoke. It was all fine, but this sort of set the stage for the workshop that took place. I walked into the office after the event and I tried my best to check in with everyone, to check in and suss out the situation and make sure that all my colleagues were still comfortable going through the workshop. They all seemed to have a smile on their faces, and goes to show the incredible resilience of this group. So then I set up 3 big tables with my classic deck of facilitation cards while my colleagues were wrapping up their day. When one of my colleagues showed up to my table to watch what I was doing and how I was setting up, she picked up the cards and she instantly panicked. She expressed how uncomfortable she felt that she had to participate in this workshop and that she felt that she was being forced to participate and that this would probably not end very well. I hadn't even done an introduction at that point. No consent was acquired. I was just setting up the tables in the interest of time, but even the setting of the table became a trigger. After a long conversation with this colleague to express my intention for the workshop, I explained to her that my questions are positive and focus on supportive relational experiences. The methods are playful and that her consent can be revoked anytime. This conversation was consent making through dialogue. She finally felt at ease. I truly believe that the ease came from the fact that she is my colleague and we had established rapport for years. There was implicit trust in our relationship that needed to be reinstated in that moment, made to feel overt. The process of acquiring consent from the larger group was much quicker. People barely read the consent. Some didn't feel the need to even sign the consent. Some laughed at it, calling it silly and academic. It was pretty apparent that everyone had a different response to this whole process. To start this workshop then, we broke up into 3 groups and set out to ask the questions I had developed. While there were technically facilitators who were the 2 managers, I tried my best to disrupt any hierarchical dynamics. I made sure to spread out pens and paper, post-it notes, and supplies so everyone felt like they could write and participate actively in the conversation. They had access to materials to express themselves equally. The questions were posed in a set of cards, and people were asked to go around to pick the next card to explore all the questions together. The fast-paced nature of the workshop, though, prevented some of these things to go smoothly, however, and facilitators had to take the lead, which reinstated some of those hierarchies again. We finally started the workshop. The first set of questions asked about the systemic constraints that the staff of this organization are consistently working within. To mitigate the stress of talking about systemic breakdowns and the traumatic impact that it has on people on a day-to-day basis, I asked the question abstractly, asking them to describe these systems by creating patterns, diagrams, doodles, and sculptures. We were able to talk through some heavy experiences and concepts by abstracting these ideas to remove the pressure and to, in a way, remove ourselves from these stories. One of my colleagues created a game out of Play-Doh, a game where you have to jump through all of these different hoops and bumps. And it's a game where no one really wins. The image on the screen shows that game. One described the system as a broken ladder, and another person described the system as a slow-moving glacier. For those who didn't feel like expressing themselves through conversation, they were able to share through drawing and making self sculptures with Play-Doh and anything else. One of my colleagues found herself drawing her dog overlooking a sunset. She finally ended up speaking about the dog as the most significant success story of the organization. He was rescued from a homeless client about 8 years ago, and now he's living a thriving life. He's our office dog and has brought the workers and clients so much joy. That's the dog on the screen. The next questions focused on relationality, interdependence, and collaboration. Quoting Adrienne Maree Brown, who says, "What you pay attention to grows." In this line of questions, I wanted to pay attention to and, in effect, grow the relationality that is experienced by my colleagues in this highly stressful work setting in order to reassert the resilience that they practice every single day by being in collaboration and being in relationship of supports with each other. Some really beautiful conversations emerged in this workshop. My colleague who felt most uncomfortable in the beginning of the workshop happened to be the most participatory and insightful in my group. That truly felt like a success. One of the most significant lessons that I learned through this workshop while building a trauma-informed practice is to be considerate of the notion of change. As I mentioned before, I went into this research with an intention to learn and generate mutual knowledge, but also to impact change. My incredible research supervisor reminded me about the notion of change fatigue. Consider the relationship between trauma and change fatigue. When immersed in situations that are constantly in flux, when we consistently feel like we are standing on tenuous ground, more change any kind of change can be really scary. As designers and design researchers, we walk into spaces and inevitably take up roles as change makers. We introduce, we innovate, disrupt, shift, generate, cause, create, etc. Change is implied, but we don't consider the impact that this implicit or overt intention to change can have through the process of researching and designing. In my example, change fatigue showed up in two very distinct ways. People were asking questions, the persisting question of why are we asking these questions? What is the purpose of this? Nothing ever actually changes. Or just the general fear of change was palpable, that these conversations would somehow open up a can of worms and something will inevitably go wrong and we will not know how to manage the explosion that will follow. A very dire sort of fear around any kind of change. This sentiment was expressed in earlier conversations with my colleagues prior to the actual workshop. To me, this fatigue and fear of disruption comes from systemic trauma and collective trauma, especially in frontline settings. It's a product of being entrenched in systems that gives us no room to breathe. Instability, unpredictability, and precariousness is conflated with the notion of change. Change becomes pretty scary. So I will leave you with a question. How do we as design researchers manage this change fatigue that comes from working with complex and constrained systems and institutions and all of the associated trauma that comes with it? Especially when robust design research tends to start with context mapping to understand participant and research partners' relationship to institutions and systems that inform their interactions with designed artifacts. For now, I will just summarize the lessons that I have learned from this workshop. The lessons are checking in and checking in again. It's fostering safety through curated spaces and physical artifacts. It's acquiring consent through dialogue and rapport building. It's recognizing that research partners and participants all have diverse needs and that disrupting hierarchies might be the best place to start. And that maybe we should leave lots of time to take the process slow. And as a method, using abstraction can really prevent retriggering of trauma. And multiple methods of expression can allow full embodied sharing of knowledge. Finally, the most important is to focus on what we wish to see grow, paying attention to the things that we want to envision in the future. To end this conversation, to end this talk, I want to bring attention to trauma from an intersectional perspective. From these workshops, I have learned to see trauma from an intersectional perspective, recognizing that types and levels of trauma impact the sense of agency held by different people, which thus informs power dynamics in a relational process. This very important idea comes from an article that I read recently, Moving Towards a More Inclusive Patient and Public Involvement in Health Research Paradigm, the Incorporation of a Trauma-Informed Intersectional Analysis. From these authors' perspectives, addressing power differentials in research is central and critical to establishing a more trauma-informed practice. The authors assert that addressing power dynamics can happen through discursive reflexivity or discursive reflexive practices. The author says that through discourse and dialogue and through reflexivity, which can acknowledge the importance of power at the micro level of the self and our relationships with others, as well as the macro levels of society. It recognizes the multiple truths and diversity of perspectives while giving extra space to voices typically excluded from expert roles. This is really what I had set out to do in these participatory workshops. Engage in a process of discursive reflexivity as a way to address power differentials and develop a trauma-informed practice by being deeply considerate of embodied experiences, which the author also describes as embodied reflexivity. Embodied reflexivity is being intentional about how we physically interact with each other and take up space in the environment of research. Considering how researchers' physical presence and performance influences participants and partners, and how research partners, collaborators, participants' capacity to interact with the environment and pre-existing relationships to the environment impacts the entire engagement process. Reflexivity in general is about committing to ongoing dialogue, as these authors assert. And it's about all agents in a research questioning our assumptions throughout, questioning dominant epistemological frameworks, identifying who holds agency and voice and who is excluded. We can begin with those who are historically, we can begin by recognizing those who are historically excluded from research processes, either because of intentional exclusion or unintended exclusion due to perpetuated trauma that shows up in hostile spaces for contribution, research, and learning. The goal then of trauma-informed practices in research is to make intentional space for different voices to ensure that these voices are well represented in the outcomes that come from research and design. I promised to present one other case study, not realizing how valuable this particular experience has been, but rest assured that these lessons are being intentionally adopted into various other research and design projects, and I hope to share those with you at a later time. For now, thank you so much for joining. I'm looking forward to the discussion that will follow.